family had a good laugh when they heard that I was preaching on the letter of the law. Most of you who know me know I'm not a letter of the law kind of girl. I'm more of a big picture person, kind of a Gestalt person. So they thought that was quite funny. So I want to start by reiterating how proud I am as a mom and as a member of this church family. I'm sure how proud we all are of our confirmation class. A few weeks ago, 5 of our young people finished their class and were celebrated here by our congregation. It's not easy being a young Christian today. Now, obviously, our young Christians don't face imprisonment the way Christians in China and Iran do. They don't face crucifixion, lines in the Colosseum, lynchings, but they face doubt. They struggle with the relevance and the paradox of a virgin birth, a sinless sacrifice, Sadducees and Pharisees. What does that even mean? Seraphim and shepherds, an empty tomb, who cares? With the mystical theology of the Trinity, 3 persons, 1 God. What? How are these abstract metaphysical concepts relevant in a world with racism and sexism, with xenophobia and inequity? How is the Bible applicable now when we're swamped by a persistent, contagious, now endemic illness without an apparent end, which has set the rights of the individual in conflict with the well-being of the larger community? Conflicts in mask mandates, vaccination mandates, and in international equitable access to the vaccine. How are the Bible and Jesus relevant when trying to navigate LGBT rights? How is it relevant as we navigate our response to the displacement of millions of people around the world due to financial hardship, persecution, climate catastrophe, war, and famine? How does it inform our individual and our national responsibility for climate change and for the earth, God's perfect creation, entrusted to us? What about college applications? What about parents who fight? What about addiction? What about your friend in the homeless shelter? How does Jesus speak to this? Our young people face doubt. The same way the Hebrews faced doubt in the time of Micah, 700 years before the birth of Christ, on the brink of an Assyrian invasion that ended the world as they knew it, and the subsequent destruction of their temple at the hands of the Babylonians with Nebuchadnezzar II. Their temple, their most holy place, the seat of their culture, their political and religious identity, wiped out. That's the first time the temple was destroyed. We face doubt the same way the Hebrews did who received the letter from which we read an excerpt today. In 64 AD, Nero was on a rampage blaming the Christians for the burning of Rome, a 9-day fire that saw 2/3 of Rome burned to the ground, which Nero used to justify widespread imprisonment and death sentences upon Christians, including the death of Paul and Peter. And it ultimately led to the destruction of the Jewish temple for the 2nd time in Jerusalem in 70 AD. Again, wiping out the most holy of places for Jews. The struggle with doubt is not new. It's common. You might even say it's a unifying theme in the Bible. While Moses is up at Mount Sinai, receiving God's Old Testament contract, or his covenant, in the form of the 10 Commandments, the Jews, having been successfully led out of slavery by God, fed manna from heaven and water brought forth miraculously from the rock. Do you remember what the Jews were doing? They were building their golden calf. Jonah doubted. He ran away, not believing in either God's ability to provide a prophetic voice for him in Nineveh or in God's promise to keep him safe. Judas doubts that Jesus is the guy. Jesus is not the warrior that he was expecting. Thomas doubts the resurrected Jesus until he can lay hands upon the wounds. Doubt is not confined to biblical people, no. C.S. Lewis was a giant of a Christian. He doubted. And he wrote about it in A Grief Observed. He was struggling with his faith and with his belief in the power of God, given the pain and the suffering his wife had endured and he had borne witness to as she died of cancer. Paraphrasing Madeleine L'Anglais of A Wrinkle in Time, who wrote in response to C.S. Lewis, "I am grateful to Lewis for having the courage to yell, to doubt, to kick at God with angry violence. It gives us permission to admit our own doubts, our own angers and anguishes, to know that they are part of the soul's growth." Paul Tillich is a German-American, a great theologian. He's buried here in Indiana in New Harmony. Tillich says, doubt isn't the opposite of faith. It is an element of faith. It's an essential element of faith. Yep, it's one of those, a personal growth experience, as the New Age gurus in the chicken soup for the souls folks would describe it. Ben Young is a teaching professor of the Second Baptist Church in Houston, and he wrote a series of 3 articles on doubt and faith, and I recommend them to you. The first article was on Mother Teresa. He describes her as an iconic figure of piety, self-sacrifice, and faith. He describes how her posthumously published book in 2007 shocked the world. This devout daughter of Christ wrote, "As for me, the silence and the emptiness is so great that I look and I do not see. I listen and I do not hear. My friends, my children, you are not alone in your doubt in the order of the universe, your doubt in a higher power, your doubt in an organizing force for the world and for your lives and for your morality." So let's talk about Jesus. Let's talk about why you can trust him, why he needs to be your moral compass. Julian. We've had moral compass conversations. Jesus was a humble, practical man. He was born a carpenter in a small town of Bethlehem. He prophesied by Micah. He was raised in a small town of Nazareth, presented at the temple as a young person, as was the custom, much like our confirmation class was. And yet he transformed the world. He turned it topsy-turvy. He was perceived as a radical, a heretic, and a revolutionary of his day. I argue that his teachings remain radical. He had a lot to say about the law. Jesus says in Matthew 5, "Do not think that I came to destroy the law or the prophets. I came to fulfill the law." Now the Jews had several categories of law. They had ceremonial and sacrificial law, which was regarding how they worshipped. They had civil law that described how a devout Hebrew should live. And they had moral law, direct commandments. In fact, in the Torah, the first 5 books of our Bible, the Hebrews have 613 laws, including some bell ringers like don't wear a shirt made with more than one fabric, stone your daughter if she fornicates, and one of my favorite, women should not worship at the same time as men, they should not worship in the same space as men, and they should not talk in church. These laws began with Moses' law, the 10 Commandments. They were enacted by the tribe of Levi, as in Leviticus, the priests, the priestly tribe, the priestly family. And in the New Testament, the work was continued by the Sadducees, the scribes, and the Pharisees. In fact, Old Testament Hebrew life was very regimented, regulated, restricted, and need I say it, for everyone, but especially for women. As it was And it was possible to be a good and devout Jew by following the letter of the law. Jesus did not come to destroy the law of the prophets, but to fulfill the law. But make no mistake, Jesus was disruptive. In Matthew 10:34, he says, "Do not think that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I have not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I have come to set a man against his father, a daughter against her mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. And one's foes will be one's own household." Definitely not the status quo. Jesus frequently criticized the scribes, the Sadducees, and Pharisees, but not about their devotion to the law, about their refusal to recognize him as the Messiah, the fulfillment of the law. And he called them out in their hypocrisy, to live by the letter of the law, to judge others by the letter of the law, but to do so without the spirit of the law, without the mercy of the law, or the mercy of love. "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, you hypocrites! If you tithe mint, dill, and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of law, justice, mercy, and faith." He challenges his disciples to live their faith. "You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt has lost its taste, it is good for nothing. You are the light of the world, but if you hide it under a bushel, it serves nothing." Jesus was salty, sassy, disruptive, stubborn, and downright obstreperous. He was the fulfillment of the law, and the old patterns of behaviors were not going to go down without a protest. You remember the Torah with its 613 laws? Well, Jesus gave us 2. Love God, love one another. We don't need ceremonial law anymore with its code of worship and animal sacrifice. Jesus is the perfect priest and the perfect sacrifice, all in one. The Son of God, handpicked, delivered, baptized by John the Baptist, blessed by the Father, which we remember on Pentecost. And the perfect sacrifice, pure in spirit, innocent of sin. Animal sacrifice as a surrogate is no longer needed. When Jesus breathed his last, the curtain separated. The curtain that separated the congregation from the Holy of Holies in the temple was torn from top to bottom. No more separation from God and his people. No more mediation and interpretation by human priests, fallible, sinful, prejudiced, foibles, like all of us. Now we have a direct conduit to God through Jesus' sacrifice. We don't need civil law anymore. Sorry, mates. Civil law for them was a way of distinguishing and separating devout Jews from the enemies around them, how they dress, how they eat, how they stay clean, how to compromise with the status quo of the day in terms of complicated family relationships and property laws, polygamy, slavery. These are addressed and accommodated in the Pentateuch. Civil law with shirts of 2 fibers, kosher foods, circumcision. The Old Testament was designed and delivered for the people of Israel, the descendants of the 12 tribes of Jacob, as they reconstituted as a faithful people of God from slavery in Egypt, wandering in the desert, and to their eventual settling in Canaan. The Old Testament, or Moses' law, was tied to a particular people in a particular place, and Jesus changed that. Remember the 2 commandments. Well, the first part isn't brand new. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your strength. This is from Deuteronomy. But the second commandment prepares the new people of God, the Christians, to embrace their neighbors and the world, to welcome Gentiles as brothers and sisters instead of viewing them as slaves or unclean or oppressors or enemies. In his letter to Galatians, Paul says, he has come such that there will be no longer Jew or Greek. There is no longer slave or free. There is no longer male or female. We are all one in Christ. We certainly didn't need traffic tickets or speed limits anymore. Here's a tough one. We don't need a separate moral code if we recognize Jesus as Messiah and faithfully and truly love God and each other. Jesus is walking the walk, not just talking the talk. He's talking about faithful righteousness, not obedience and legal compliance. He's talking about reverence for God, not prideful acts or a desire for approval. Jesus talks of hypocrites praying and tithing only when people are watching, casting the first stone, judging others despite the log in their own eye. The love that is these two commandments must drive our thoughts and our actions if we are to embrace it, if we submit to it. In Matthew 24, Paul reminds us that anyone who hears the good news, the gospel of love, and does not act in accordance is foolish, building on sand. But one who hears and acts is wise, building on a rock. The action driven by this heretical gospel of love, comes from what God does in our life through our love and faith. It does not come from ourselves. It cannot come from ourselves. We screw up every time. But in God, all things are possible. Jesus teaches us how he fulfills the law, how the Old Testament is revealed in the New Testament, and how the New Testament illuminates the Old Testament, as the Canadian literary critic and theorist Northrop Frye explains in The Great Code. In Galatians 19, now before faith came, we are imprisoned and guarded under the law until faith would be revealed. Therefore the law was our disciplinarian until Christ came, so that we may be justified by faith. This is a new law, a new covenant. We are no longer subject to blind obedience and discipline of the old law, the Old Testament law. But we are children of God through faith. Paul Tillich, in his Dynamics of Faith, captures it. History has shown that the most terrible crimes against love have been committed in the name of fanatically defended doctrine. He emigrated from Germany in 1933. Fanatically defended doctrine doesn't only exist in the Old Testament Jews or in the Nazis. There's plenty to go around right here and right now. In Romans 13:8, the one who loves fulfills the law. Now, no matter how tempted I am to toss the baby out with the bathwater, because there are plenty of those 613 laws that I don't like, they make me uncomfortable. Jesus wasn't saying that Christians are lawless or divorced from the Old Testament. Quite the opposite. If you own these two commandments, if they are written on your heart, if every decision, act, word, and thought is filtered through the lens of law, through the lens of love, all those other rules, the important ones, the moral imperatives, the absolute truths, they aren't obsolete, they're redundant. Jesus has it covered. If I love God and we love each other truly and deeply, I can't murder or cheat or steal or betray. It's impossible. It does not compute. Now, I'm personally still negotiating the more minor civil agreements like stop signs and speed limits, occasionally, infrequently, a swear word. But Jesus has the big stuff covered. This new covenant, these two commandments, they are tougher, they're bigger, better, bolder than what came before. In Matthew 5 and Luke 6, in the Sermon on the Mount, after the blessings and the Beatitudes, after calling his disciples to heed him, to be salt of the earth and light to the world, he addresses the law. And he does so by juxtapositioning the old law of Moses and the old law of Moses transformed by him, by the fulfillment of the law. The scholars call these the antithesis. You have heard it said, but I say to you. Moses' law and Moses' law transformed in the light of the Messiah, the fulfillment of the first covenant of the law of Moses, the end of that era, the resolution to what was before. The theologians call that Jesus' eschatological fulfillment of the Old Testament prophecies and law. Now, usually I'm tossing out million-dollar doctor words, so here's a million-dollar theological word, eschatological. It means relating to death, judgment, the final destiny of the soul and of humanity. Jesus is the end of the first covenant and the beginning of the new covenant. Our relationship with God and with the law and with how we live our faith is transformed, no longer through law, but through love. This law of love is so transformative that it requires a righteousness far surpassing the church leaders of the day. Remember that Jesus frequently criticizes the scribes and the Pharisees, again, not for their devotion to the law, but for their refusal to see the new kingdom, the heart of the law. This new law isn't a recipe or a list. It's not behaviors done by rote and ritual. As Jesus told the crowd and the Pharisees, it's not what goes in the mouth that defiles the person. Remember those civil laws about kosher. It's what comes out of the mouth that defiles. For what goes in the mouth goes out the stomach and in the sewer. But what comes out of the mouth proceeds from the heart, and that is what defiles. That was Matthew 15. You know it, the Pharisees did not like his radical transformation of their life's work. They did not like him trespassing on their perceived authority. The new law is a new covenant for a new people of God. Jesus died and sacrificed once for all, as we read in Hebrews. We no longer need daily animal sacrifices. It is no longer about Israel, a specific people in a specific place. They are no longer the only redeemed covenant people. That has passed. Jesus brings the gospel of love to all so that we may make disciples of all nations. Matthew 21:43 says to his Jewish audience, you remember Matthew was a devout Jew. Therefore I tell you, the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to a people that produces the fruit of the kingdom. He's talking about the spiritual fruits from Galatians 5. Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and everyone's favorite, self-control. In Romans 7, in the same way, my friends, you have died to the law through the body of Christ so that you may belong to another, to him who has been raised from the dead, in order that we may bear fruit of God. Remember Matthew 34, do not think that I have come to bring peace. I have not come to bring peace, but a sword, setting family against family. He means that the new covenant of law supersedes all allegiances, all other beliefs, all other laws and oaths, even family and tribe, even race and neighborhood. He doesn't inevitably mean that following his law of love will result in chaos in your family. He means that if it's a choice between the law of love and living with a people who does not honor the law of love, the choice of a Christian is easy. We have two commandments: love God, love each other. The very next verse states that anyone who welcomes you welcomes me. Whoever welcomes me welcomes the one that sent me. And in Hebrews, do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for in doing so, some have entertained angels without knowing it. The new covenant, the new law of love, it was radical then, and it's radical now. It was hard to conceive that it was even possible from the perspective of a beleaguered, occupied, oppressed remnant of Israel, and it's still hard to conceive as possible today. I challenge you, let your salt be salty, let your light be bright, and let love do the rest.